All right. Well, we want to welcome you again to another one of our series. Danny, we've been doing this, as we said, I
Yeah,
think the other day, since March,
March.
on our series on the
Crazy.
church and politics. So
Home
we're
stretch now. 3 weeks away.
I'm not sure if that's the good news or the bad news.
Yeah,
It's been kind of, I was
true.
thinking the other day, it's been kind of mild, right? The political scene I thought was going to be really bad. I'm just wondering
Oh,
if
it's
it's going to
it's
get,
it's it's gonna get there.
that's what I'm worried about. It's going to get a lot worse after November 5th or whatever day that is, or however long it takes for that decision to happen. So, but if you're just joining us, we've been doing a series really kind of asking the question, what does it look like to love our neighbor as ourselves? And so we've done a series on the church and politics, Christian nationalism, we've done abortion, we've done race, and just a host of other topics. If you go to the Determined Truth YouTube page, subscribe, and then you'll be automatically notified about other live streams that we have going on or coming up. We have some more next week. And then if you go to that page, go to the playlist, Politics in the Church, and that's where you'll find all the live streams that we've been doing in this particular series. So today we want to look at another issue, a controversial issue to some extent, but certainly one I think, Danny, that's both deep to,
Yeah.
And sensitive for both you and myself. The issue of mass incarceration. If we believe, that all people are made in the image of God and that all people are beings of value, then we shouldn't allow any system to exist anywhere that denies others their just inherent dignity of their humanity, even if they've committed a crime and are quote unquote worthy of being punished or whatever that might mean. It's ironic and almost sad that Americans were proud of the fact that we have probably the most advanced civilization in the history of the world, and yet we have 25% of the people in prison in the world are in American prisons.
Yeah.
It's not just that we have so many people in prison either, Danny. I think the problem includes the fact that there's a dehumanization that occurs in our prison system, and that we have a disproportionate number of people of color in our prisons. So, yeah, that's really the issues that we want to discuss. So we have two guests today, Danny, that we're excited to bring on. First, we have Hannah Bowman and Andrew Krinks. Hannah is a literary agent and a theological scholar, a writer focusing on connections between Christian theology and prison abolition. She's the founder of Christians for the Abolition of Prisons and holds an MA in Religious Studies from Mount St. Mary's University in Los Angeles. Hannah, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. You're welcome. And Andrew Krinks. Andrew's a writer, educator, scholar, organizer, and movement builder working at the intersection of religion, racial capitalism, mass criminalization, and abolition in Nashville, Tennessee. He teaches college, seminary courses on religion, theology, ethics, carcerality, abolition, and social justice and conduct. And he conducts participatory action research on the impacts of prisons and policing. So, Andrew, welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you again so much for joining us today. Let's just begin briefly with just having you guys introduce yourselves a little bit more. I'm going to give a little bio, but tell us some more about yourselves, curious facts, family, whatever you want to let us know.
Well, I live in Los Angeles. I got sort of really radicalized around questions of prisons a long time ago. I was doing prison ministry as a college student working in a juvenile detention center for girls, and kind of carried with me for years after that desire to get back to like solidarity and presence with incarcerated people. And that led me to a whole lot, more study of the prison abolition movement, study about criminal justice reform and how it works and doesn't, study about how the system got the way it did. And so kind of everything I've done has been growing out of that idea of how can we as the church be in solidarity with incarcerated people. So I'll start
and
there.
You got two young kids, right?
I do. I have two little kids.
Awesome. Congratulations.
Andrew's like two, right?
What's that?
I think Andrew's got little ones as well.
All right.
I also have two young kids, 1 and 4, and I grew up in the Northeast, but have lived in Nashville, Tennessee for 20 years, where I am now. And in a similar way, I was first invited into a prison by a former professor of mine, an undergraduate, and that was the men's maximum security prison here in Nashville, Tennessee, and as well as the women's prison, and have been going in and out since then in different capacities as a member of spiritual community on the inside. There have been phases where my main church experience and practice was inside a prison. And, through other avenues became interested in these things, including working with unhoused people in Nashville who were telling me a lot about their experiences with law enforcement. And what I heard so regularly was just how often, you know, for simple acts of survival, like using the bathroom or laying their head somewhere or walking
Mm,
somewhere, that they were regularly harassed and cited and arrested for that because of
mm,
their housing status. And so at the same time, those two things were happening for me. And so kind of became interested in the process of criminalizing people and who gets criminalized and who doesn't. And simultaneous with all that, I was a master's and then doctoral student in theology. So I am both encountering all of those things on the street level, so to speak, and then also studying theology and political systems at the same time. So kind of the rest is history, and I've been thinking and writing about it since then.
Wow.
excellent.
You know, Rob and I, we've been. Oh, go ahead, Hannah. Go ahead.
I was going to
Jump
say, I
in.
think what Andrew points to that's so important in all these conversations is that it's so focused on the practical and the relationships, because I know, it for me and Andrew, I think for you as well, the theories about what do we do about prisons, right? Who gets
Mm,
criminalized and how, why is the system the way it is? How can we fix it? Is always also dependent on like those relationships and the on the
Right.
ground work with people who are being criminalized or who are incarcerated, and like how are we actually building those relationships of solidarity.
Okay.
mm,
Yeah. Thank you. You know, as Rob mentioned earlier, and we've been doing this series on a variety of topics and wading into it. And part of our journey doing this is for us to learn as well, and for anyone in our audience to learn as well. And we always make the disclaimer is you don't have to agree with everything we say. You just want you to think. We want
yeah,
people to
yeah.
think and interact with that. And so that's one of the reasons we wanted to wade into this today, because it is such a pervasive and important problem. I wonder if you two could, either or both of you could talk a little bit and just describe for us the problem itself,
Mm,
wherever you want to go, talk about mass incarceration, the system, speak about the numbers, give some scope to this so that people can, if they're not aware of of the scope of what we're talking about
right.
and the nature of it. So anything you might want to see descriptively about where we are as a country in terms of our prison population and our prison system. Either one of you can jump in as you want to on that.
Anna, do you want to start or do you want me to?
Sure. So I pulled up some numbers really quick, just to start us off. These are from the Prison Policy Initiative, which runs
Mm,
great data visualization for every year. So for this year, the number of people locked up in the United States across prisons, federal prisons, local jails is 1.9 million, almost 2 million
mhm.
people. And they point out that that's 583 people per 100,000 residents, which is a higher rate than any other country in the world. So I
Yeah,
think
right. By
that's a good
far.
starting
Yeah.
point, is just that we're locking up more people than anywhere else in the world. And it's a big system. It's got a lot of different pieces because the federal prisons and the state prisons and the jails are all separate systems with, separate conditions. But when you add it all up, we're locking up more people than anybody else does. And the question
Mhm.
is kind of, is why. So I thought that might be a helpful place to start, just to
Sure.
give a
Yeah.
sense
Yeah.
of the scale and the fact that, this isn't a necessary and normal part of all of human existence. This is a choice that we've made in our society, and that features of our society have led to this place where we are in some sense less free than anybody
And
else.
that
Yeah.
and that number doesn't include those who are still on probation or parole, right?
That's correct. That's correct. There are, let me see if I can pull the number up, but there are several. I want to say it's a couple million more at least on
Okay.
probation
Mhm.
and parole, as
Wow.
well. So that's only people who are inside. It does include
Right.
people. There's about 500,000 people almost who are pre-trial detention. So those are people who have never been convicted of a crime, but who are
Okay.
being held because they can't afford to pay bail. And often, most of the populations in local jails are people who are detained pre-trial because it's taking a long time to go to trial, because bail amounts, even if they're relatively low, are something that they can't afford to pay. So people who are poor really tend to be the ones detained pre-trial. And I mention that because the conditions in local jails are often worse than they are in
Mm,
state and federal prisons, that there's fewer opportunities for programming, that there's in some sense not designed for long-term habitation in quite the same way. And yet you'll see people who are locked up in jails for 5-6 years before they go to trial.
wow. Wow. And Andrew's going to chime in here in a second, but I think we just need to think about that for a second, because we have more people per capita than any country in the world, and yet we think of ourselves as advanced society, which we are, progressive society, free society, and yet you're talking about like North Korea, you're talking about China, you're talking about some of these countries that we think of as deprived, as unsafe, as places you can't speak your mind, and yet they have fewer people in prison than we do in the United States. That starts to put the scope of the problem, I think, into perspective. So, Andrew, you want to add some things to that?
Yeah. So it's important, I think, to note that this notion of mass incarceration is describing a phenomenon that really begins in the early 1970s,
Okay.
where you have this rapid expansion that has a cause in many different causes behind it, including like at a policy level, at what counts as a crime and what doesn't, and all the kind of shifts that lead to that. Um, and I'm convinced by the account that says that part of why the country moved in that direction to radically expand incarceration as an intervention that was meant to solve or address in some way a lot of the social problems in the country. The account that I'm convinced by is that coming off the heels of decades of these freedom movements, the civil rights movement, Black freedom movement, other movements for greater freedoms for citizens and residents who are traditionally marginalized, and that you have this kind of pendulum backlash swing that says that instead of granting people the things that they need to thrive in society, instead we start to rely upon carceral penal responses to various social problems, and so that
Mhm.
leads to this upward expansion that by the 2010s, you have these peaks of 2.3 million or so at its highest number of
Mhm.
people incarcerated at any time. But I also want to note it's important to note that this is not a phenomenon that has its origins in 1970 or 1972. It very much is an older phenomenon, at least by a couple hundred years, and that captivity of various kinds is a very American phenomenon, actually. And a lot of people have studied this contradiction between this seeming orientation towards freedom
Mhm.
that's present at the birth of this country, and yet the fact that there's massive amounts of unfreedom in the form of, eradications of indigenous peoples and the enslavement of African peoples. And then also kind of in the same context, the incarceration of other dispossessed peoples of all racial identities, including European
Mhm.
peoples early on. And for these various groups of people at the beginning of this country and the colonies that preceded it, incarceration and captivity were pretty early on a kind of central form of responding to social problems that uh, persisted and then grew in new and terrifying ways, 2 centuries later or so. But it's important to note, I think, and we can get into more of the history if we want, but that it's not like an accidental feature of our nation. I think that it's more a little bit more essential, unfortunately, and central to the history of this country.
Okay. Now, you alluded to the rapid increase that began like 40 years ago or more, 50 years ago. Um, what is it that led to that rapid increase? Is this part of the war on drugs? Is this what's the role of that in terms of this rapid increase? Either one of you can answer here.
Do you want to take that
I
one,
think
Stella?
there are a whole lot of reasons, right? And there's a lot of scholarship about what is it that causes this, and frankly, there are differing opinions. I think
Okay,
among scholars
that's good
are
to know. Okay.
why this happened. But I think there are a few like concrete things I would throw out there as examples that kind of fit into your larger theory. Part of it is the war on drugs, and Michelle.
Oh,
Oh, we lost her.
we lost her. So her internet was just about to go. So when she comes back on,
Mhm.
Andrew, you want to You want to
Sure.
take over, and I'll bring her back on when she comes back?
Yeah,
Thank you.
sure. So,
All right.
I think I can pick up roughly from where she was going, that there are different accounts of this, of kind of some of the reasons why this happened. But I think that prime among them are these kind of, like I said before, these kind of, well, there she is. Let's let her resume. I was about to
Okay,
resume
sure.
for you.
All right,
Go ahead.
fine.
I'm sorry, these were the technical difficulties I was afraid I
That's
might have.
all
They
right.
may
It
have
happens. It happens. It's part of the world.
so the war on drugs and the idea that the drug laws led to the big growth of the system. That's one part of it. I think another
Okay.
piece that doesn't get talked about maybe enough is the idea that we have much longer sentences for violent crime than a lot of other countries do.
Okay.
And
All
so
right.
the length of sentences, we have more people who are sentenced to, life without parole, really long sentences like that. And particularly over, I guess it was in the 1980s when things like truth in sentencing laws started to be passed that said people were not getting parole, right? They had to serve 80% of their sentence before getting parole or things like that. And so there were all these things that were together. And some of it is
Okay.
absolutely drugs. Some of it is the criminalization of, like Andrew was talking about, survival strategies for people in poverty. And so as poverty, increased, one way that the state dealt with that was by saying, well, we're just going to make it, illegal to sleep on the street, right? We're going to make the
Right.
things you have to do to survive illegal. And that led to more
Mm.
criminalization. But there is also, I think, a really deep kind of punitiveness that's led to things like 3 strikes laws, right? And life sentences
Yeah.
and some of these really long sentences, when you'll see that in European countries, kind of famously, there are almost no sentences longer than 20 years, right? Whereas we have people who are serving life without parole who were sentenced as children.
Hmm. Okay. Wow.
Yeah, I know that there's a great one of the problems that you've alluded to it, but maybe we can unpack a little bit more, is the disparity, both in terms of rich versus poor, and of course the poor of our country are disproportionately high in terms of people of color. So there's racial aspects to this too. A quick anecdote: in my early ministry years, a long time ago, in the late 70s, early 80s, the very first church.
1970s. I just want to make sure everyone
Yes,
understands.
19.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry, David.
No, my very first time I was a pastor, I was in my late 20s. Was a church in the rural South, and in the shadow of one of the most notorious prisons in the country,
Mm.
Parchment in Mississippi. And there was a case that happened. There was any number of cases where the poor and where and people of color in our area sometimes just disappeared. Sometimes they were a lot of them were put in jail. But there was an instance where the son of a very prominent family, white family, landowners, was actually caught and convicted of a very massive child abuse, child pornography ring.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, there's not room for him when he's convicted in Parchman. Was allowed to serve his sentence in the local county jail of his hometown. And during the daytime, kind of walked the streets of the city as long as we reported back in the evening.
Oh, wow.
And it was like, wow. People of less means were immediately sent down the rabbit hole of the system, where he was credibly convicted, massive evidence of horrible crimes against children, and was allowed to walk free, basically. Had an enormous amount of privilege. So that was one of the first introductions to myself of the disparity in the way the law is applied. So I know this is an issue. I wonder if you guys could, that's my little anecdote about it. I know you guys have a lot more experience in looking in this of the problem of the disparity between rich and poor and people of color as being in this system. Could you maybe speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I can start on that. I actually want to say at the front end here, that what you're alluding to and that what we can speak to more, I think, now in a moment, is evidence of the fact that this system is actually working as designed, as opposed to it being broken. This is a common kind of contention in the narratives around among people who are concerned about these systems is it's kind of popular to say, and understandably so, that this system is massively broken. But it's only broken if our starting point is the idea that these exist to execute justice with parity and to keep us safe,
Okay.
when the origin story tells us that they actually didn't have a lot to do with that on the front end. And so, where I could start is that the very first prison in the UK where punishment was not just where the captivity itself was the punishment. That starts, in the 1700s. Before that time, captivity is brief, and then it's followed by some kind of corporal punishment or some other kind of service or something like that. But when punishment, time served itself in captivity becomes the punishment, I often ask people, who were the first people um, who filled the halls of those institutions, and essentially exclusively very poor people. So the very first institutions that came into existence to hold people in captivity as punishment for some form of offense as defined by society were poor folks, and they are folks who are forced through systems of exploitation into not having many other options for
Yeah.
survival,
Yeah.
who often end up begging or wandering and asking for support to survive, or resorting to sex work or prostitution, or like any number of things that people still resort to in order to survive when they lack other reasonable and accessible options. And it's important to name that to me because that is a part of the way that I understand that this system simply came into existence to deal with poor folks and non-normative folks, which eventually meant also non-white folks, so Black people in particular, as well as Indigenous people and other people of color. And that the fact that today we have these immense disparities in who is represented in the criminal legal system is not evidence only of the fact that you have people with racial bias in the system. So you certainly do. You've got police who there's widespread racial bias among many police forces. There are judges and prosecutors who show racial bias. There are at all levels of the system, there are people who exhibit racial bias as individuals, but before there's ever racial bias as individuals, there's a system that came into existence to deal with poor people and other people who are not white property owning men. That it really comes into existence to deal with those populations. And so that, I think, is a story that we need to not forget when we think about why we have the disparities that we have today, and to understand that that person in Mississippi who was allowed to serve his time in a more not at Parchman, but in a different context, and to kind of go free during the day. That's an example of the system working as it was designed. Like people, the landed aristocracy of Mississippi are not people who the prison system in Mississippi was made for. And so, there's also this phenomenon of the fact that when somebody does commit a crime that that is witnessed in some way, I say that to say there's a lot of people who are committing technically things that are illegal who are never, seeing any jail time or any kind of conviction or anything like that. But it's typically people from impoverished and non-white communities who are getting the bulk of the attention from law enforcement on the front end. And then when you get to the point of having to defend yourself in a court context, it's poor folks who have to depend upon a system that is massively overburdened, public defender system, whereas folks with means can afford to get representation that's devoted to them in a different way, and that usually means that they don't get the same kind of time.
Yeah.
So that's some of the things I'd speak to historically, and maybe Hannah has other things to add.
I think it's just worth pausing with that to say, like, that is upsetting thing. Like, because Danny, you share a story like that, and obviously we all find it to be a very viscerally upsetting story. We say, wait, but that's not fair. And I think it's hard to look at it and to look at the historical evidence and say, oh, this is what this was always designed to do, because we don't want to think that people would do that, right? I mean, we don't want to think that you would build a system saying, well, what we really want to do is control the people who seem a problem, right? And that's kind of what the system was always for, whether it was on the basis of race, because certainly there was among a lot of the people kind of building up the system, especially in the United States, but also, or whether it's on lines of class and money, and this sort of idea of, we have a social problem. It's not even necessarily, I think, that any particular individual was thinking about other individuals. It's more that we have a social problem, right? We don't want to see this social problem that makes us uncomfortable, and so we're going to solve it by hiding it, and hiding it. And that's what we see happening, today all the time around questions about homelessness and visible poverty, right? And the fact that people feel really uncomfortable when they see unhoused people on the street. It makes them feel uncomfortable or unsafe, even if there's no threat. And so often the response that we see from our local politicians is, well, we need to get those people off the street, and we don't have housing, so we need to put them in jail. We'll cite them. We'll whatever. We don't care where you go as long as you don't stay here, right? And I think it's that, which is an impulse to store comfort in the way things are, right? It's an impulse for people for whom things are basically okay to say, but I don't want to see all the things that aren't okay, so we're going to hide them by putting them in our prisons.
Yeah.
Wow. Interesting. A quick commercial interruption, by the way. Everything that we do here at Determined Truth, these live streams, the work that Danny and I do with 100 pastors in India each week, the blog, the podcast, and all that stuff we do for free. We don't charge anyone. We refuse to put anything we do behind a paywall so that the poor can't access it. Only the wealthier can. Just doesn't make any sense to us at all. But we can only do all that with your support. So if you will are able to support us, go on to determinedtruth.com, go to the gift tab. Make sure you select the drop-down box, Rob or Danny, not Vinny, right, Danny?
Not Vinny.
Yeah, not Vinny. But in terms of who you want the money to go to, right? We'll try to put up something on the web sooner or later where you can give to Rob and Danny at the same time, or we do the live streams together, or Rob and Vinny who do the podcast together. And also, if you're watching this somewhat live, I have a live stream tonight that you guys might want to be interested in, where I'm speaking at a conference, an online conference on the kingdom of God and power. And that's exactly what you guys need to be talking about. The way power works is that it benefits those who are in power. Even if they're trying to be good, they're ultimately going to do whatever is necessary to benefit themselves. And as a result of that, it's going to be detrimental to those who are not in power. Sometimes the good ones might not be as bad as for the poor and the oppressed, but for the most part, power is corrupting and power is abusive. So I'll be speaking with David Crump. David will be doing the second part of that presentation on Christian nationalism. You can register for that on the Determined Truth homepage. It's a different conference, but the registration is free, or you can pay $40. But none of that goes to Determined Truth. It goes to a different organization. But that's tonight at 5:00 Pacific time as well. So we can go a little bit further on this conversation, Hannah and Andrew. Just can you give us a little bit more of an idea of just what it means in terms of being incarcerated and the nature of the dehumanization that happens in the prison system? I think, Andrew, you made a couple of references earlier to it, but just how the prison system dehumanizes individuals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to start, if I can, again, by going back a little bit and then bringing it into the present.
Sure.
And, one of the interesting things, you'll often hear a lot amongst prison reform discourse about how our current system has gotten so off track. It's so dehumanizing. They don't care about rehabilitation anymore. We really ought to get back to the roots when there was some kind of concern for rehabilitation. And I always like to introduce a little bit of a pause around that presumption, because the truth is that, at least in the American context, the first penal institutions, there's jails and there's different things like that, but then you've got the birth of the penitentiary system, which we could talk about kind of some of the theological dimensions of it.
Okay.
But it's very much a theologically it's a manifestation of theological ideas fused with
Okay.
political ones. You hear it in the word itself, penitence. And interestingly, you've got all these records of writers and public commentators in the late 17, early 1800s who were traveling some of these new novel institutions called penitentiaries and writing about them, and writing about how gruesome and dehumanizing it is, and how um, you know these are men and women buried from the world. You get phrases like that a lot.
Hmm.
A lot of references to like burial and tombs and things like that. And what some scholars have done, and I've tried to intervene on this as well, is to show that actually even the the people of seeming goodwill who wanted to create a system that wasn't so publicly gruesome like public executions were and things like that, but to create a space where there's seemingly some kind of reform of the individual and their kind of spirit. Um, what's actually true too at the same exact time as you have this sense of benevolence is this premise that in order to be reborn, you have to die first. And so you have these deliberate rituals, including at some of the first penitentiaries where entrance to prison for the first time included, wearing a kind of a burial shroud almost, where you're
Oh,
covered
interesting.
entirely. You're often your head is shaved, you're given different clothes. This is all much of this still the same, maybe not the burial shroud part. But also still the same is that you lose your name and get a number.
Hmm.
And so there's all these stripping away of self and identity. And you even had some of these kind of theologically trained chaplains and wardens at the time who were saying, quoting scripture to say, you have to be refined by fire before you can come out on the other side as a new person again.
Wow.
And so this kind of deliberate dead like dehumanization that's incorporated into the working of the system from its get-go, and from the moment when people today often look back and say it was kinder and gentler then, but
Hmm.
without knowing some of that history. And then to bring it to the present, I'll just say, from my own experience of accompanying and befriending and being in community with people on the inside, is that um, you know what you lose in a lot of ways is your agency.
Hmm.
Mhm.
You cannot do almost anything without asking somebody
Hmm.
first. You can't move through space without asking someone and getting permission first. So
Hmm.
when I go to Tennessee's death row here in Nashville at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution, I once was doing like a research project, included interviewing some of the guys out there, and I like kept track of the number of times that I had to, like, the number of like barriers that I had to pass through where
Oh,
somebody from behind a screen or somewhere was pushing a button to let it happen.
yeah.
And just thinking about the materials, we're talking about like steel and plexiglass and razor wire and brick and like all of these thick materials, and that there was more than 10 doors, maybe 13 or so, that I had to pass through to get to where I was in a room with the people I was coming to see. And so that was true for me as an outsider. You can imagine what it's like for an insider who
Yeah.
is totally dependent upon the will
Yeah.
and the mood and really everything of the people who operate the system. And that, the sum total of that is really just, as we're saying, very dehumanizing. Humans are made to have agency. We here in this
Yeah.
live stream probably take for granted the fact that we can, like, I can walk out of this room and walk out of my front door and look up at the sky and touch the
Yeah.
grass. But so many of the folks I've known on the inside, including people who are in higher security environments like death row, talk about, I haven't touched grass in 30 years, or I
Wow.
haven't looked up at a sky that wasn't through a cage in 20 years. And you think about the kind of the impact that that has on somebody. It's lifelong, and I'm always truly astounded at people who come out who still have their wits about them after having gone through that for so long. So I'll pause there, but just to say, yeah, the dehumanization is is built into its structure itself, and it's not incidental. It's kind of intentional, I would say.
You have anything to add there,
Can I,
Hannah, with that?
can I build on that? Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I
please.
think that's exactly right. What Andrew's saying about agency and the idea that if we're talking about how do people be accountable, how do people,
We're losing you again, Hannah.
We're losing. Yeah.
Oh, my back.
Kinda. You're a
So-
little fuzzy. Try it again.
All right, I'm going to try. I think
Okay.
when we talk about how people take accountability, that is so important, right? That affirming the self, like that's how you change. Is you change by learning to understand yourself as a different person, and so that all gets lost. The look on faces, I'm worried I'm losing my stream again. But that I think that's one thing about the system is when you impose on people and take away their agency, you're actually preventing the kind of rehabilitation you like to do. And the other thing that I think is really, that really gets that I noticed that I thought was really particularly dehumanizing around prisons, beyond the sort of the physical plant, right? The fact that it's ugly, that the food is terrible, that there's lots of violence, that you can't go anywhere, is the fact that when incarcerated people work to support each other and work to support each other's survival, which they do, right? Which happens all the time because people have societies in there and they work in solidarity, but that those acts of solidarity are actually seen as a threat often by the system and are kind of discouraged. And so the ways that people support each other get in the way of the security system of the prison. So that's another way that I think the system is built and intended to dehumanize. It's not a place that's designed to encourage people to work together in a pro-social way. I hope some of that you could hear.
Yeah, we definitely.
Yeah.
Let me be the devil's advocate. I hate saying that because who wants to be the devil's advocate? But nonetheless, that's the expression that we're going to work with for now. And some respond, and I just want to hear how you handle this by saying, "Well, these people deserve it because they committed crimes, and it's their fault." And they're in the situation they are because of what they've done. How do you respond to that common idea?
Yeah, I can start. For one thing, I think that there is a lot of presumption going on in that kind of response that isn't as common in the sense of common sense as it has always been. Well, let me put it another way. I don't think that there's any eternal law that says that the natural consequence of hurting another person is that you go to a cage for a significant portion of your life. Like I don't know, there's a lot of notions of punishment in a lot of precedent for notions of punishment in sacred texts in the Hebrew and Christian traditions. And yet at the same time, there's a great deal of room, and we can get more into this, for thinking about how you respond to harm in ways other than just disposal. And I don't know that there's so many ways to get at this. On the one hand, if everybody got what they deserved in that sense of deserving, then we'd all be a lot worse off, meaning like we'd all be punished a lot more because we're all doing stuff that deserves, some form of punishment. But then, you can also come at this from the point of view of, as Hannah was speaking to a moment ago, of, what serves the continuation of healthy community. Like what might provide repair, what might provide some sense of a pathway forward for the people impacted by crime or violence or harm of some kind. And I'm more interested in that question than I am in the deserving question, and not to sidestep it, but
yeah, sure,
I think that just desserts is one thing, but having pathways to having a society that functions well is another. And
sure,
we can speak to this more, but as Hannah was starting to say, the response to harm that is caging somebody, which is a form of disposal, does very little to serve those impacted by their actions. And we could speak more to that and actually kind of discourages accountability in some ways that might seem counterintuitive to a lot of us. But I'll pause there, and we can get into more on that if we'd like.
My response to your question, which is I think building, is not just saying exactly what Andrew just said, and is that I have a practical response and a theological response, right?
Okay.
And my practical response is, if what we want is to keep people safer, then we want people who are guilty, who have done terrible harm to other people, to change and not be the people who do that harm. We want them to take accountability. And the way you do that is by leaning on the relationships that people have. And so they found that the things that make people rehabilitate and take accountability are things like their relationships with their children, right? They want to do better for their children. They want to do better for their loved ones. They want to do better for the community of people they care about. And yet, prisons are designed to keep people away from the people they love, from other people in their community, from all the people to whom they would be accountable and sort of who they care about, right? And so in that sense, the whole thing's just backwards and ineffective. So that's my practical answer is that if what you want is a response to violence that is going to lead to greater safety and making sure that person doesn't hurt anybody else, and that's often at least one of the major things that survivors of violence want, is to make sure this person doesn't hurt anybody else, then incarcerating someone is not solving that problem, right? Unless you absolutely lock everyone up and never let them out again, which is denying the dignity of that life, is denying the possibility of change. So that's the practical answer. My theological answer to they deserve what they get is man, we're Christians, right? Like we have
touche
about being saved by grace, and I think if we lean on whatever atonement theology we prefer, whatever we want to say, if we lean on the evangelical and Jesus paid it all or whatever it is, we believe that God treats us better than we deserve. And I think that's a little bit trite, but I think it's an important theological point to bring to this question of deserving, is that's we worship a God who doesn't see that as the last word in human flourishing.
That's exactly what Luke 6:35 says. Go ahead, Danny.
I want to jump in and take us a little bit in a slightly different direction, because we're going to run out of time here, and I'm very curious about this. And that is, when I was prepping for this and reading a lot of the things that the both of you had written and talking with some other people about this particular subject in prep for this, one of the things that came to my mind anyway was what you just described, Hannah, in terms of the way accountability works. It presumes a sense of community that I'm not sure exists in our country. In other words, and it seems almost like there has to be a foundational build, a reorienting of the way we even think about ourselves as a society and communities. In large portions of our country, particularly with the mobility and some people moving around, I realize, to me, it wonders, in what sense does a person feel accountable to a community in a country that has, at least in my lifetime, seemed to get less and less communal and more individualistic and maybe tribal, and that different tribes have different values and approaches. So I'm curious as how, if the answer to this is to build accountability systems into the fabric of what we do, that actually promote the idea of healthy rehabilitation. That's the piece that seems to me to be a little bit elusive. So help me understand how we go about that.
So I think that's actually a really interesting question. And I'll say something, and then Andrew, if you want to jump in. But there's been a lot of work done about that in the sort of restorative justice and transformative justice movements. But what I'm thinking of particularly is something called pod mapping that was come up with by the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. And they were dealing with precisely that question, the fact that it felt like people would talk about the community, but they didn't really, nobody really knew what it meant. Like, what does it mean to be accountable to a community? Who is the community? And I think their response was to think really concretely about who it is. And I think it's a useful exercise for everybody, actually, is the idea of a pod is you think about who is it that I could rely on if something happened to me, if I were hurt, if I were in need, who are the people I can rely on? Those are the people who are kind of accountable to me in a certain sense, but who are the relationships I can rely on if I need help? And then who are the people who I'm accountable to? Who is it that I turn to if I've screwed up, if I've done harm and I want to change? Who is it that I'm going to turn to? And a lot of times we find that until we start thinking about those pods, we don't necessarily have those relationships in place, right? And so I think it's useful for all of us to think about putting those relationships in place, right? And to think about, as we're building, like as you talk about larger communities, building them around those questions of, okay, but who specifically is it who I'm accountable to in this work, in my actions, in what I'm doing, right? Because I
Yes.
think you really because you're right that it can be a very elusive thing, and a lot of the work of, I think, building kind of outside of these carceral systems is saying, what does it look like to make a space where other kinds of accountability are possible?
Right.
I'll pass it to
Mhm.
Andrew.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate all that you said there. And just to build on that, I think that the question actually is a very perceptive one, actually, because it points to some of the more foundational problems that lead to a system like the one we have. And one of them,
Okay.
I believe, that is pretty endemic to this experiment called the United States of America is individualism.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, like, from the get-go, a penal system is a system where, you know, seemingly there is some conflict between people of some kind. We've already spoken a little bit to the fact that there are often hierarchies of people who are in conflict, and that results in different kinds of responses depending on who is hurt. But nonetheless, there's conflict between people, and then the state intervenes and says that they will take over from here. Person who is a survivor of this, you can now go that way, and we'll enter in as the party. So that's why, it's the state of Tennessee versus whoever, in these legal records. And so, um, the state, we essentially are outsourcing the hard work of dealing with our problems to this like administrative
Hmm.
power, um, rather than practicing the certainly challenging work but important human work, to which I believe we're called, which is to work out our work out our problems. Like, you know, I I am I recently, just a quick anecdote, and the way to kind of wrapping up my thoughts is that recently, we have a 4-year-old who was in a very 4-year-old state of mind recently when he was on our back deck, screaming in displeasure that a babysitter had come, because his mom and I were going to be going out for the evening, and was outside of a closed door screaming like, "I want mommy," because he didn't want to see the babysitter. And then 10 minutes later, police knocked on our door.
Oh.
And they said, "We got reports of a child screaming for their mother. We wanted to check in and see what's going on." And I was not happy about the fact that this was happening, because this was some toddler stuff going on, not a police matter. And what's upsetting to me, there's a lot I could comment on with it, but for the purposes of this conversation, this answer, what's upsetting to me is that that was a moment of somebody outsourcing the work of human interaction to the state, in this case, an armed agent of the state, to come to my door.
Hmm.
If I was not a white person, by the way, it would have gone
Yeah.
possibly
Yeah.
very differently. When there's questions about children and how they're being treated, the state often intervenes with black folks and other folks of color quite differently,
Yeah.
in ways that end up with family separation often at the end of the day. So everything was fine. He went away. But the point is that, we have so often think that the way to solve even very, very minor things that take place in our community, like the music is on too loud next door, we outsource it to an entity that is allowed to, by law, use violence to make things stop. And we miss out on so many opportunities for negotiating and building community with each other when we do that.
Hmm.
And some of the most profound uh, solutions to, you know our reliance upon mass incarceration and policing, um, come not at the intervention of, policy change, which is certainly important, but at the intervention of, like, community level
Yeah.
stuff. Where if there's an issue in our apartment building, we're going to create a phone tree so that we can call each other and
Mm,
try to go talk to that neighbor rather than calling in the police because we know that that may lead someone down a road that changes their life irrevocably.
mm,
And to have these other kind of small level interactions, um, and little seeding of community networks that are, I think, part of the central ingredient in creating a future where we're not depending upon institutions that rely upon disposal and caging to deal with the problems that could be
Yeah.
dealt with in much more kind of basic human interaction types of ways.
Yeah, if I hear you both correctly, and I think you were um, talking about the real need to establish these communities and these what they call them pods or however they work. It's just, and that
Mhm.
makes obviously I think makes perfect sense. I think we've all
mhm,
understood. It just seems that unfortunately that's such a massive undertaking given the current state of where we are and the disintegration of community that we've experienced. You hope that there's a point where we reach the tipping point where we say we've got to do something to come back together as a community.
No, and I
I
think
think.
we go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think we don't have to think of it as a big scale thing, right? It's more of a it's almost like Adrienne Marie Brown's concept of emergent strategies. It's more about all of us doing the little bit we can
Yes,
where
I
we
agree.
mhm.
are, right?
Yeah, yeah,
That's again,
yeah,
I
I
think that's a very
complete
church way of thinking in a lot of ways
I
that,
100% agree with you on
we
that.
build things
yeah.
through the relationships we have. So you're right that like as a big scale, how do we solve the lack of trust in our society? That's not something any four of
No,
us here in a Zoom room can solve, right? But
no,
but I think that, I think a lot about as and I think being a parent of little kids makes you think about community a lot, right? Because all of a
sure,
sudden you're in this community of I know being in public school, having kids in public school opened up for me this whole community that I had not been part of. And all of a sudden,
Mm,
all these other people who you may not have anything else in common with, except that your kids are friends and they're together and you have to
exactly.
right,
make
right.
common decisions, right? And so all of a sudden, people in your neighborhood, people at your school, you're working together on things. And I think those are the kinds of relationships we can build on, whether it's your neighborhood or your church. But it's like you start with how do we solve these problems in our community? How are we
Mhm,
dealing with the people? And if we're again, I know we keep talking about unhoused people because I think it's so visibly
yeah,
a place where these issues kind of really fall in our society right now. But how are we as individuals or as churches dealing with our unhoused neighbors, right? When we see
Right,
people who are living off, what are we like? Do we understand those people as our neighbors and as part of our neighborhood? And are we figuring out
yeah,
how to care for them? Or are we outsourcing that to the state and saying, well, we don't have anything to do with that, right? There's these
right,
people on our church campus and we just want them to go away. And so I
exactly.
think yeah, there's little it's all doing those little things.
okay, excellent.
Let me, Rob, can I ask
Yeah, please, please, yeah, please.
the elephant in the room to me at the end of this because we're going to run out of time here is because we try to keep these within a decent amount of time length, although you can go on forever and ever.
Yeah,
Is
that's yeah, yeah.
all of this uh, community-based accountability alternatives to outsourcing this kind of thing to the state or whatever? At the end of the day, there are bad actors. There are some people who are violent offenders, who are bad actors, who, no matter what kind of, they're going to, don't we need some kind of policing or some kind of, what does it look? There's a place somewhere, is there, for those? I realize in the grand total of all these 2 million plus people that are in prison, and the problems that we have, truly violent offenders are a small percentage of that, but they do exist. So, what does it look like to deal with in terms of public safety, in terms of all just people that primarily public safety? How do we deal with that?
I can say a word and then would love to hear what Hannah has to say too. You know, uh, Part of answering that I think needs to start. We need to begin with the fact that you know asking ourselves the question: Why do people end up hurting each other the
Mhm,
way that they do? And if it's just that some people are bad, like so often I ask the question to people a lot, like, why do we have police in prisons? Like, why do they exist? And a typical response is there's just a lot of bad people in the world.
mm,
But that's not so satisfactory to me. Like what makes someone do, first of all, I don't believe as a Christian in like some people are bad and they just are, and that's the end of the story. But also kind of sociologically, I don't find it that helpful just to think in terms of people who are in their essence bad, but rather people do things that hurt others. You can call that bad if you want. And why do they do that? So, this doesn't explain the every instance of harm or
Right.
wrongdoing or violation or crime or violence, but it explains quite a bit, and that is that we live in a country where, at a systemic level, people's needs are not being met. Their most basic
Hmm.
needs are not being met, uh, and that is a story to me, it's a story in part of the way our economic system works by design, and the fact that we don't that you have to kind of earn the means of survival, as opposed to just being granted them outright, because we're human and should be able to have what we need to survive. But so much of the research shows that people resort to violence, if we're talking about violence, which is one portion of the reason that people end up in prison, not all of it. Um, that people resort to it for a number of reasons, including that they're themselves the victims of violence,
Hmm.
that they are not able to meet some of their material needs, that they don't have a network of support of some kind. So
Hmm.
these are all things we've been talking about already. We're talking about
Right.
poverty, we're talking about
Sure.
mistreatment, we're talking about isolation and individualism and not lack of community, and all of which feeds into cycles of violence. And so then you have the state literally repeating the same things that are the cause of the violence. And I'm not the first to come up with this observation by any stretch, but that the prison is mirroring the causes of people's violence in its
Hmm.
response to people's violence. Taking away their community, isolating them, not giving them uh, breaking down their access to resources to thrive, and subjecting them to further violence. So it's just simply repeating the cycle. And so if we met people's needs in a more robust and thoroughgoing way on the front end, that to me would cut down on a significant amount of the harm and violence that happens in communities. It would not get rid of all of it, though.
Right.
When there is still the violence that remains after people's needs are met in a more thoroughgoing way, there are ways to respond to it that get to the root of it rather than just responding to the action itself in a way that, as Hannah was speaking to earlier, try to prevent it from happening again.
Okay.
Whereas our current system does little, if anything, to try to deal with why it happened in order to prevent it from happening again. And if anything, it makes it more likely that it will happen again the way that we do respond now. So I'm dancing around the question a little bit,
No, that was yeah.
but trying to speak to the fact that it's not, kind of questioning the inevitability of people being bad
Right.
actors.
Yep.
So I'll pause there and let Hannah take over.
I have a couple of answers again, I think, Danny, to your question.
Yeah.
One of which is I don't know any abolitionist who objects to the use of force to stop imminent harm. I mean, I don't know anyone who says you can't fight back in your own defense, right?
Mhm.
And that I think gets a little bit to that question of safety, right? When you're saying, well, but isn't there a place? Don't we have to use force to stop bad people? So I do think what we see, I'll just note in the system, is we see that, for example, survivors of intimate partner violence who fight back in their own defense, especially if they're women of color, often end up incarcerated. And that
Sure.
happens
Yeah.
all the time. And so we actually don't see the system functioning in a way that says, hey, we don't want harm to happen to you, and we understand if you have to defend yourself against it, right? So the system is not providing safety for everyone by any means. So that's kind of my first answer. I think the deeper answer is that, like Andrew, I would really question the writing off of some people as bad actors, because I don't believe that there are any people who are just monsters, right? And I think we have this tendency to look at violence and look at horrible, horrible acts that people commit, and they do terrible violence to one another. And we have a tendency to look at that and say, this person is a monster who has to be separated away from us. There's nothing we can do. We can't engage with them. And I think, my answer is, look, violence is relational and it is contextual. It happens in a particular relationship for a particular reason. And it may be a terrible reason. It may be a petty reason. It may be a reason that's coming from some psychological brokenness on the part of somebody doing violence that has brought them to a place where this is the choice they've made, where they've made a terrible choice. So I'm not trying to diminish any of the impact of the harm or the gravity of the harm.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, these things are happening in a particular relationship for a particular way. It's not, people are not predatory animals who just go out and do violence without any reason or any internal thought. And I think what that means is that in responding, we can engage, right? Like we always have the choice, rather than making people disposable, rather than disposing and separating, we always have the choice to engage. And that doesn't mean we say, oh, well, there's nothing we can do about it. They've got to go free and continue to hurt people. But we always have the choice to continue responding by saying, what's going on? What led to this? Why did they do this? Whether it's a systemic cause, as Andrew has pointed to, or whether it's a sort of psychological cause, which often come from, systemic issues as well, right? But we always have the option to sort of to get curious and to say, okay, what can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again? What does it look like for this person to live a safe life? But it's different situation. It's all answered.
Sorry about that. I wish we weren't running out of time, because I think there's so much more to discuss. This sounds so much, Hannah and Andrew, like the conversations that I have a lot working with Israel, Palestine, and that whole conflict. What causes people to launch bombs over walls? What causes people to become terrorists? And can we eliminate those causes and thereby? And some people just simply say, "Oh no, there's no way we can, because all Palestinians or all Muslims are radically anti-Jewish," and that's just an easy cop out. It's not legitimate. And what you're saying is people just aren't innately this way, and there might be a person here or a lone actor here or there. I don't want to cut this so short, though, that I don't give you the time. Did you want to add something to that?
I was going to say, and people are affected by ideology, right? And I think, we're talking a lot about economic causes, we're talking about psychological causes, whatever, but obviously one of those causes is ideological, and part of the work is the sort of like de-radicalization from ideologies, whatever ideologies of empire and war and whatever lead people to do violence.
Yeah.
And the other part of that always becomes the fact that we always want to look at ourselves as on the good side of the ideology, and then it's just so easy to look at them as the bad, them as the other, them as the evil. And I don't think the gospel allows us to do that. I'm very curious, Andrew. I know we don't have time for this, but to have you flesh out more, which we can't do now. Of you made a reference to the fact that the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible has avenues for dealing with criminality, and I really want to see that fleshed out. Maybe you can send me some resources or whatever, and Danny and I can flesh that out in a future episode. We can bring you back on, but I don't want to let you go without giving you the opportunity to kind of explain to me what you're doing now. I know, Hannah, you work for you're the founder of Christians for the Abolition of Prison. So to kind of tell us what that is. I'll put some links to all this, your websites and anything else in the show notes, or on the YouTube page as well. But just give you guys both an opportunity to kind of tell us what you're doing now and why that work is so important for you.
Well, Christians for Abolition is mostly me and a website. And what it is really a resource hub for Christians who are interested in prison abolition, who are interested in questions of restorative, transformative justice, and learning more about these systems, and in learning about them really theologically, to find sources. So it started as me saying, I'm going to put up a list of all the books I've read on this topic, because when I Google, I don't find anything, right? And so it's really, and since then, I've written some things there, I've collected some things. So it's really a place to go to say, one of our recent projects, reading through the Revised Common Lectionary, and offering resources for preachers that were based on abolition, that were saying, here's a prison abolitionist way of reading this text. What might you do with it? So it's really a space for theological thinking and education. And that's been the kind of focus of my work recently, has been around those issues of like theology, education, and how can we start thinking theologically about prisons, or continue, because people have been thinking theologically about prisons, but how can we really kind of continue thinking theologically about prisons, and specifically about prison abolition, and the idea that maybe we can build a world without prisons, and what does that mean and require of us theologically as Christians.
Okay, excellent. Andrew.
Yeah, so in a couple different ways, I'm working on different things. On one level, I am involved with people in my community here in Nashville, working on, organizing and educating community members about ways that we can reduce our reliance upon traditional forms of quote unquote public safety, and to invite people to expand their imagination around what that looks like, including through interventions in like our city's budgeting process, and how much money goes towards police versus how much goes towards the things that sustain, people's well-being in terms of, housing and education and things like that. So that's one level in which I'm involved in some of this. At another, I continue to write. I have a book that just came out, and I am working on more projects, including starting to interview some folks who are doing abolitionist organizing from a kind of spiritual or faith perspective of one kind or another, including a Christian one, and trying to better understand, how we can understand the idea of abolition, which again is not just taking something away, but it's creating conditions for our current way of responding to harm to become less of the norm. And how do people who are organizing for that kind of help us understand a vision that actually resonates with some of our spiritual traditions, including the Christian tradition of a world where we respond to these things differently, where there is this idea of, you know, uh, release from captivity of its various kinds, and what the meanings are there spiritually and socially and politically. And so some of my kind of more research and writing and thinking work is located there right now. So yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, again, thank you so much for your
Yes.
time and your willingness to serve us and let us understand this. I think I'm getting a better grasp of things. Danny, anything you have?
No, I
before we
appreciate
leave?
the conversation. It's been really helpful. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I hope we can stay in touch. And thank you guys for watching. If you like the episode, subscribe to the channel, let other people know about it. We'd appreciate that. So thank you.
Thanks.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Yeah, that was very helpful.